My story should have ended with a warm Thanksgiving feast. Instead, it ended with me on a cold Boston sidewalk, kicked out by my own son. "Mum, please just go. Don't make this worse," he said. But he and his wife forgot one thing. I didn't just build that house. I own the foundation of their lives, and I am about to pull it all down. My name is Eleanor Vance. At 58 years old, as the founder of the Vance Cultural Foundation, I have navigated the most ruthless boardrooms in Boston. I thought I understood strategy. I thought I understood assets. I was wrong. The cold November air clung to my coat as I inserted the key into the lock of my own Beacon Hill townhouse. The brass felt foreign in my hand. From within, I could already hear it, the high, brittle laughter of strangers, a thumping bass line that rattled the antique glass. It was not the sound of Thanksgiving. It was the sound of an invasion. The moment I stepped inside, the warmth hit me, but it brought no comfort. It was a suffocating, unfamiliar warmth, thick with competing perfumes, and the alien scent of was that saffron and cardamom in the turkey. My son, David, and his new wife, Serafina, had taken over the holiday planning. In truth, they had taken over my home. Sarah, a woman who called herself a life coach with all the sincerity of a rattlesnake, had turned our family gathering into a networking event for her ambitious, empty circle. I was barely 2 steps into the foyer when she descended upon me. She was wrapped in white cashmere that probably cost more than a VLF grant. "Eleanor," she said, her voice loud enough for the dozen strangers in my living room to hear. She kissed the air near my cheek. "That suit is vintage. We simply must get you something new for Christmas." Her eyes raked over my simple wool suit. It was timeless, tailored, and worth more than her entire outfit. But that was not the point. The point was to mark her territory. From across the room, her mother, Margot, a woman who looked like she'd been pickled in expensive brandy, raised her glass. "Serafina, darling, leave her be. The house finally has some life in it. Let's not dampen the mood." A nervous laugh rippled through the guests. I saw David, my son, standing near the fireplace, smiling weakly. He refused to meet my eyes. I ignored them both, my gaze fixed on the wall above the mantelpiece. The space was empty. No, not empty. Where the grand portrait of my late husband, Arthur, should have been the portrait of him at his desk. The co-founder of everything we built there was now a massive, gilt-framed mirror. It reflected back the loud, shallow party, doubling the intrusion. A cold dread, sharper than the street air, settled in my stomach. I walked toward the fireplace, my footsteps silenced by the new, plush white rug that had replaced Arthur's worn Persian. "Sarah," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Where is Arthur's portrait?" She waved a dismissive hand, a massive diamond flashing on her finger. "Oh, Eleanor, it's in storage, of course. It was just so heavy, so dark. We need to live in the present, mustn't we?" The mirror reflected my face. I looked pale, furious. "That painting," I said, keeping my voice level, "is not decoration. It is the heart of this house. It is the legacy of the VLF." "It's a painting," Sarah snapped, her life coach mask slipping to reveal the raw ambition beneath. "And this is my house now, too?" "Mom," David finally spoke, walking over, his hands stuffed in his pockets like a guilty schoolboy. "Don't make a scene. Sarah worked so hard on this dinner." A scene. I turned to him, my son, the boy I had raised alone, the boy I had built an empire for. She removed your father from his own home, and you call my objection a scene. The guests were watching now, pretending to sip their cocktails. The music seemed to fade. Sarah stepped between us, placing a proprietary hand on David's chest. "If you can't be positive, Eleanor," she said, her voice dripping with false concern, "perhaps you should wait in the study. You're upsetting David." I looked at my son, waiting for him to defend me, to defend his father. David just nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Mum, please, just wait there until dinner starts. We'll call you. It's better this way." It wasn't a request. It was an order. I was being dismissed, banished from my own living room, in front of strangers, by the very people living off my name, in my house. They had mistaken my composure for weakness. They had no idea what they had just done. I turned my back on the party, the bright chatter in the living room feeling like an assault. I walked down the hall and opened the door to Arthur's study. It was the only room in the house they hadn't dared to touch. Not yet. The air in here was different. It smelled of old paper, leather bindings, and the faint, lingering scent of his pipe tobacco, an aroma I'd had preserved in the wood polish. The heavy mahogany desk was just as he'd left it. His worn leather chair still faced the window overlooking the quiet garden. Out in the hall, I could hear the muffled thud of Seraphina's music. In here, there was only a reverent silence. I sat in his chair, the leather cool against my skin. People looked at this house, at the VLF nameplates, at my seat on the board of the symphony, and assumed I was born into this. They knew nothing. I didn't come from money. I came from a 2-bedroom apartment in Somerville and a scholarship to Boston College. Arthur was the one with the legacy, though not of money. He was a poet, an educator, a man who believed with a burning, impractical passion that literature could save a soul. I was the business mind who believed he was right. We started the Vance Cultural Foundation not in a boardroom, but in the damp, stone-walled basement of our first apartment, with a folding table and a used typewriter. He was the soul. I was the strategist. My eyes fell on the small, cloth-wrapped package on the edge of the desk. The gift I'd brought tonight. Inside it was the true foundation of our lives. Arthur's first collection of poems. The Boston Letters. He hadn't just written it. He'd made it. I remembered him at that basement table, his long fingers carefully stitching the bindings, his face smudged with ink and glue. He hand-bound 100 copies in cured leather. We took them to Quincy Market on a freezing Saturday and sold every single one, raising the first seed money for the VLF. We thought we had forever. Then, 15 years ago, forever ended. It was a Tuesday, an aneurysm. One moment he was laughing, arguing about a line in a Frost poem, and the next, he was gone. The world expected me to collapse. In a way, I did. But the part of me that was all business, the part Arthur had always relied on to turn his dreams into reality, went to war. Grief is a powerful fuel. I poured all of it into the VLF. I took our small local fund and, in his name, I built it into a national, multi-million-dollar institution. I built it while raising David, our son, our brilliant, beautiful boy. I poured every bit of love and hope I had left into him. I unwrapped the gift I'd brought, my hands steady. There it was, Arthur's personal copy of the Boston Letters, the leather worn smooth as river stone at the edges from his own hands. The gold leaf on the title was faded, but the impression was deep. This book was not just paper and ink. It was our seed money. It was our youth. It was the physical manifestation of our partnership. They thought the VLF was just my job. They thought this house was just real estate. They didn't understand. The foundation isn't a corporation. It's a living memorial. Every grant we give, every student we sponsor, is a continuation of the man I lost. And Serafina, with her cheap perfume and her desperate social climbing, had just advised me to forget him. She had declared war on a ghost. She had no idea how fiercely that ghost was protected. Holding Arthur's book, the silence of the study was filled with memories of David. After Arthur died, David became my entire world. He was only 13, and our shared grief forged a bond I thought was unbreakable. He was the one good, bright thing left. I gave him everything. I wanted to shield him from the hardship I had known, and from the sharp edges of the loss we had both endured. It was the best schools, Milton, then Harvard. It was a stunning apartment in Back Bay the moment he graduated, paid for in cash. I wanted him to have stability, a foundation. And when he showed even a flicker of interest in the foundation, I brought him onto the board. I gave him a title, a generous salary, and a legacy to step into. He was so charming, my David. He has his father's smile and easy charisma, the kind that draws people in and makes them want to please him. But I always worried, in that quiet place a mother keeps her fears, that he was missing Arthur's fire. Arthur had a spine of steel, a core of conviction. David had a core of accommodation. He loved being David Vance of the VLF. He loved the applause at the galas, the respectful nods from civic leaders, the weight of his name. But he hated the work. He found the grant proposal reviews tedious, the community outreach a bore, and the fundraising dinners a chore unless he was the one being celebrated. I can see us so clearly, walking through the public garden on Sunday afternoons, the sharp autumn air turning our cheeks red. That was our time. We'd talk for hours about the future of the VLF. "I'll take over one day, Mom," he'd say, slipping his arm through mine. "I'll make you and Dad proud. I won't let you down." I believed him. I wanted to believe him. Hearing his voice now, out in the hall, a strained, false cheerfulness as he laughs at something one of Serafina's vapid guests says that promise feels like a bitter joke. It echoes in this room, hollow and cold. When did the shift begin? I try to pinpoint it. Perhaps it was that time. Maybe 2 years ago, before her. I'd questioned a small expense on his VLF account, a dinner at Moo, for $300 on a Tuesday night. "It was a donor meeting, Mom," he'd said, a little too quickly. "Just cultivating a new prospect." But the prospect never materialized, and the expense report was vague. I let it go. I told myself he was young, still learning. I told myself it was an error in judgment, not a flaw in character. I had to believe in the man I had raised. But I am Arthur's wife, as much as I am David's mother. I am a strategist. I built a multi-million-dollar foundation from nothing, and you don't do that on blind faith alone. When I created the trust fund that David would one day inherit a fund entirely separate from the VLF, built from my own private investments, my lawyers advised me on standard clauses. I added one of my own. David doesn't know about it. My lawyer, Brenda, calls it the ethics clause. It's a simple, ironclad provision that states if the beneficiary engages in acts of moral turpitude, criminal behavior, or actions that bring significant public disgrace to the Vance family name. Control of the principal reverts entirely to me, the grantor. I built it as a shield to protect him from the world. It never once occurred to me that I would need to use it to protect our legacy from him. I trace the infection back to its source. It was not David's momentary weakness. It was her arrival. Serafina? She appeared at the Vance Cultural Foundation annual gala 2 years ago, a polished shark navigating a philanthropic pond. She hadn't bought a ticket. She'd arrived as the +1 of a junior city councilman, someone she'd likely drop the moment she found a bigger fish. David, unfortunately, was that bigger fish? I saw it happen. I was standing near the orchestra, and I watched her spot him across the ballroom. She cut through the crowd with a predatory grace. Within 20 minutes, he was bringing her over to me, his face flushed with an excitement I hadn't seen in years. "Mum, this is Serafina," he'd gushed, his hand already proprietary on the small of her back. "She's an incredible brand consultant and a feminist activist. She has the most amazing ideas for modernizing the VLF." Serafina extended a hand. Her nails were perfect, her grip firm, practiced. "Eleanor?" she'd purred, her voice a low, smooth monotone. "I'm so honored. Your work in cultural preservation is simply legendary." It was the perfect line, but her eyes betrayed her. I have spent 30 years reading people across boardroom tables. I've stared down billionaires and placated mayors. I know the difference between respect and assessment. Serafina's eyes were not warm. They were cold, blue calculators. As she smiled at me, I watched her gaze flicker to my earrings, assessing the carats. I saw her scan the room, categorizing the guests by their bank accounts, and then her eyes returned to me, the main prize. She wasn't impressed by my work. She was impressed by my assets. David, blinded by her beauty and her manufactured, aggressive confidence, saw none of it. He was a moth to her very expensive, very artificial flame. The rebranding of my son began almost immediately. She convinced him he deserved more. "Darling," I overheard her cooing to him one evening in the garden, "you are the future of the Vance name. You can't be driving that 5-year-old Audi. It doesn't project success." 2 weeks later, David came to me, full of awkward, rehearsed justifications, asking for an advance from his trust for a new $100,000 Porsche. I knew it was her, but I was still clinging to the hope that this infatuation would burn itself out. I signed the check. Then came the necessary vacation. "He works so hard, Eleanor," Sarah told me over a lunch she'd insisted upon at L'Espalier, leaving me, of course, to pick up the tab. "He's just burning himself out. He deserves a real break, to recharge his creative batteries." A 3-week trip to a private villa in St. Bart's followed. I paid for that, too. But he didn't come back recharged. He came back changed. He was distant, parroting her empty corporate jargon about synergy and leveraging assets. He was convinced that my steady, principled leadership of the VLF was stifling and outdated. She was isolating him, recasting my protection as control, and her avarice as ambition. I am not a trusting woman by nature. After the St. Bart's trip, I did what any CEO does when they suspect a hostile entity has breached the perimeter. I hired a private investigator, the best corporate intelligence firm in Boston. I wanted to know exactly who this Serafina, the supposed debutante from New Orleans, actually was. The file landed on my desk a week later. It was bound in simple black. The truth was far worse, and far more pathetic than I had imagined. She was not a debutante from New Orleans. She was from a bankrupt, forgotten family in rural Louisiana. The polished accent was a complete fabrication. She had left a trail of failed startups, small businesses she'd convinced local men to fund before she ran them into the ground. And the debt. She was drowning in it. The investigator found over $400,000 in defaulted student loans, maxed-out credit cards, and unsecured personal loans. She wasn't a life coach or a feminist activist. She was a desperate, cornered predator, and she had just sunk her teeth into my son, her last, best hope for a lifeline. I was looking at a balance sheet of pure desperation, and that, I knew, made her infinitely dangerous. The infatuation didn't burn out. It metastasized, just 6 months after they met. David brought Serafina to my study for a glass of sherry. He looked nervous. She looked triumphant. "Mom, we have news?" David said, taking her hand. "We're getting married." 6 months. My son, whom I had nurtured for decades, was giving his entire life to a woman he'd known for half a year. I looked at the file on my desk, the one detailing her mountain of debt, and I felt a cold knot of dread. I offered a strained congratulations. That's when Serafina took over. "We want something very small. Eleanor? Intimate," she said, pulling a leather-bound planner from her bag. "Just our closest friends. Maybe 300 guests." My eyebrows rose. 300. And of course, it has to be the Fairmont Copley Plaza, the Grand Ballroom. It's the only place with the right dignity. She had a binder. She had swatches. She had already booked the venue, contingent on my check. The budget she presented was itemized, and the total at the bottom made my breath catch $250,000. For a small wedding. For a woman who, according to my report, couldn't qualify for a new credit card. I looked to David, expecting him to see the absurdity, the naked greed. He just smiled, his face hopeful and naive. "Isn't it perfect, Mom?" Later that evening, he came to me alone, just as I knew he would. She had sent him, armed with the only weapon that had ever worked against me, my love for him. "Mom," he said, taking my hands. His were soft, uncalloused. "I know it's a lot, but this is the most important day of my life, my only life. You won't let me down, will you?" It was emotional blackmail, pure and simple. He was leveraging our entire past, his father's memory, my 30 years of devotion, all for a party. He was asking me to buy his happiness from this woman. I told myself it was the last time. I told myself that paying this would secure his future, that once she was married, once she felt secure, the grasping would stop. I wrote the check. It felt like signing a surrender. A week later, Margot, Serafina's mother, arrived from Louisiana, supposedly to help with the arrangements. She moved into the largest guest suite in my house and immediately began to treat me like the paid staff. She would leave her teacups on antique tables, ring the small service bell I kept on the sideboard as a joke, and make passive-aggressive comments about how I managed my own household. Serafina did nothing to stop her. David, sensing the tension, simply made himself scarce, spending more and more time at her apartment. The wedding itself was a grotesque display of my money and her complete lack of taste. It was all white, crystal, and mirrors a cold, sterile spectacle that had nothing to do with David or our family. or love. I sat at the head table, a silent ATM, watching my son beam at his bride. Then, Serafina stood to give a speech. She raised her glass, her eyes shining with practiced tears. "I want to toast," she said, her voice echoing, "to family. Not the family you're born with, but the family you choose." She smiled at David and then at her mother. "To choosing our own path and building a future free from the dusty, heavy past." She never mentioned Arthur. She never mentioned me, except for a brief, dismissive, and of course, thanks to Eleanor for the arrangements. The guests, her guests, all applauded. I felt ill. I slipped away from the table, needing air. I went to the ladies' lounge, the opulent marble room empty and blessedly quiet. I was running cold water over my wrists when I heard the door swing open, followed by Serafina's high-pitched laugh and Margot's gravelly reply. They hadn't seen me in the alcove. "You pulled it off, my girl. You pulled it off," Margot said, her voice thick with triumph. "Please, Mother." That was the easy part. Serafina's voice was different now. All the softness was gone. It was hard, metallic, and cold. "The ring is on my finger. The house is next. What about the old woman? She watches you like a hawk." I held my breath. I heard Serafina spray perfume into the air. "Be patient. She's strong, but she's old. The old woman won't live forever. And when David inherits, we control everything. The trust, the house, all of it. The VLF will be ours." The door swung shut, leaving me alone in the marble silence, my heart hammering against my ribs. It wasn't just my money she was after. It wasn't just the house. She wanted to gut the VLF. She wanted to destroy Arthur's memorial. And my son. My son was the key she was using to do it. The war had begun. They returned from their 2-week honeymoon in Bora Bora, a trip I had also paid for. A wedding gift, she'd demanded, and arrived on my doorstep with 6 suitcases. "Mum," David said, avoiding my eyes as a driver carried their luggage into my foyer. "Sarah and I were thinking, it's just, with the market the way it is, it seems so foolish to rent." "We're going to save for a proper deposit," Serafina chimed in, gliding past me as if she already owned the place. "It's the financially responsible thing to do. You don't mind, do you, Eleanor? It'll only be for a few months." I minded. I minded terribly. But David was already looking at me with that familiar, pleading expression. "Just for a little while. Mom, to get on our feet." That was 6 months ago. They never left. 3 weeks after they settled in, Margot's bags appeared. "My apartment lease was up," she announced, "and darling Sarah just needs me here to help her settle into her new responsibilities." She took over the primary guest suite, the one overlooking the garden. My house had been fully and completely occupied. The transformation was gradual, then sudden. It started with small things. The worn, comfortable furniture in the sitting room was replaced with sharp-angled, white velvet sofas that were impossible to relax on. Then, my collection of first-edition poetry, Arthur's Passion, was moved from the library shelves. They just looked so cluttered. "Eleanor," Sarah had explained, replacing them with meaningless, colour-coordinated decorative objects. "It's all about clean lines now, a clean space for a clean mind." Then, they came for Arthur. His study remained my fortress, but the rest of the house was systematically purged of his presence. His favourite armchair, the one with the worn arms where he used to read to David, disappeared. "We donated it," David told me. It was getting so threadbare. "Mum." The photos of him on the hall table were replaced with glossy 8 by 10 professional portraits from their wedding. The final violation was the noise. Serafina started hosting her goddess empowerment workshops in my living room twice a week. She used the VLF name, of course, without my permission. Join Serafina Vance. The online invitation read, at the historic Vance estate for a day of transformative alignment. She was charging her clients $5,000 each for a catered lunch and a session of listening to her spout meaningless platitudes. My home. The house Arthur and I built as a sanctuary for art and literature had been turned into a stage for her grift. I was a ghost in my own halls. I found myself retreating to my bedroom or Arthur's study just to escape the sound of their voices, the presence of their things. David, now completely under her spell, had become her enforcer. "Mum, it's just stuff," he'd say, reciting her lines. "Why are you so attached to the past? Sarah's just trying to bring this place into the present." "This isn't about the present, David," I'd argued, my voice tight. "This is about erasure. She is erasing your father." He'd just sigh, a long-suffering sound that made me want to scream. "You're being dramatic. You just don't like her." The breaking point didn't come with a shout. It came with a polite, professional phone call. It was from Mr. Agajanian, the owner of the most respected art gallery on Newbury Street. Arthur and I had been his first clients, decades ago. "Eleanor, my dear," he said, his voice warm. "A pleasure to hear your voice. I'm just calling for a final confirmation. Your daughter-in-law was in this morning regarding the 2 small constable sketches from your library. She was hoping to arrange a private sale. She said you were downsizing." My blood ran cold. The constables were Arthur's most prized possessions. He had bought them with his first major teaching bonus, long before the VLF. She said, Mr. Agajanian continued, that the funds were for a new VLF initiative she's spearheading. But, of course, as the art is legally titled to you and the Arthur Vance Trust, I cannot proceed without your explicit, written consent. She wasn't just redecorating. She wasn't just disrespectful. She was actively trying to sell my husband's legacy from under my nose to fund her fraudulent workshops. She had crossed the line from social climbing into outright theft. "Mr. Agajanian," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "Thank you for your diligence. There is no sale. There will never be a sale. I am handling the matter internally." I hung up the phone. The feeling of helplessness was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. This was no longer a family dispute. This was a hostile takeover. And I was done being a gracious victim. The attempt to sell the constables was an act of desperation. I realized she must be failing. Her workshops weren't attracting enough clients. The grift was running dry. Her only remaining option was to move on the main prize, the source of all the family's influence and liquid capital. The Vance Cultural Foundation. She made her move at the next quarterly board meeting. She couldn't present herself, as she held no official position, so she used my son as her puppet. David, looking pale and rehearsed, stood to address the board. "Esteemed members," he began, reading from a pre-written script on his phone. "I believe the VLF is stagnating." I kept my expression neutral from my position as chairwoman at the head of the long mahogany table. We are failing, he continued, to connect with a modern, dynamic audience. That's why I am proposing a new initiative, the VLF Empowerment Branch. Serafina, who had insisted on attending as David's guest, sat beaming from a chair against the wall, projecting pure triumph. David went on to describe a series of high-cost, high-gloss wellness summits and female leadership retreats, all to be hosted by Serafina. Of course. It was a thinly veiled attempt to hijack the VLF's endowment, millions of dollars earmarked for literacy programs and arts grants for the underserved, and redirect it into a startup fund for her failing life coach brand. When he finished, there was a polite, confused silence. The other board members, old guard Bostonians and academics, looked at me. "Thank you, David," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. I did not look at Serafina. I looked directly at my son. A question. How does charging $5,000 a ticket for a wellness retreat in Newport align with the VLF's charter mission to provide arts education to Boston's low-income communities? David fumbled. It's about empowering the leaders who can then impact those communities. I held up a hand. No. It was the first time I had ever publicly and unequivocally opposed him. The VLF, I stated, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet room, is not a venture capital fund for its board members' spouses. The foundation exists to serve the needy, not to finance a vanity project. Proposal denied. Serafina's face turned white. Then, right on cue? Her eyes welled with tears. David shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You always do this?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "You never trust me. You just want to control everything, just like you always have." He stormed out of the boardroom. Serafina, giving me one look of pure, unadulterated hatred, gathered her things and hurried after him. The boardroom was silent. I looked at the other members. Now, if we can return to the quarterly budget. Inside, however, a terrible, cold certainty had settled. I had seen his eyes. It wasn't just weakness. It was greed. He didn't just want my approval. He wanted the money. And he wanted it now, without the labor, without the sacrifice, without the wait. He wanted the reward Arthur and I had bled for, and he wanted to hand it to that woman. But they had miscalculated. They thought I was a sentimental old woman, blinded by maternal love. They forgot I am a CEO. My suspicion hadn't started with the gallery call. It had started weeks earlier, when David first began pushing this rebranding nonsense. After that first conversation, I had placed a quiet call to Mark, our chief financial officer, a man of profound integrity who had been with me since the basement days. "Mark," I had said, "I want a full, discreet audit of every discretionary account managed by David. I want to see every receipt, every transfer, every dinner bill. Go back 6 months." The report had been on my desk for a week, locked in my private safe. Mark had found it. The small, $300 donor dinner from years ago had been the seed of a much larger decay. My son, in the 6 months since Serafina had moved into my house, had systematically embezzled over $150,000 from the foundation's operating funds. It was all there in black and white transfers to her consulting firm for services not rendered, charges for her car, payments for their lavish dinners, charges from jewelers. It was blatant, it was foolish, and it was a felony. My son was not just a victim. He was a criminal. That night, I didn't wait. I called David and Serafina to my study. Not the study in the house, which they had contaminated, but my formal office at the VLF headquarters, a room of steel and glass overlooking the harbour. It was 1 week before Thanksgiving. They walked in. Serafina looking bored and entitled, David looking sullen. They clearly assumed this was another lecture about the disastrous board meeting. "Sit down," I said. They sat opposite my desk. I didn't offer them a drink. I simply took the black binder prepared by our CFO and slid it across the desk. "What's this?" Serafina asked, not touching it. "The budget again? We told you. Your model is archaic." "Open it," I said to David. My son, my only child, opened the binder. I watched his face. I saw the blood drain from it. His eyes scanned the first page, a summary of the transfers, the dates, the amounts. He flipped to the next, a copy of a bank statement, and the next, a receipt for a diamond bracelet I had certainly never authorized. He started to shake. "Mom," he whispered. I can explain." "Can you?" I asked, my voice flat. "Can you explain $150,000, David? Can you explain grand larceny?" He just stared at the page, and then he did exactly what I expected him to do. He broke. He put his head in his hands and began to sob. Great, racking, pathetic sounds. "I didn't mean to," he cried. She just, there were so many expenses. I was going to pay it back. Mom, I swear I was. Please, don't do anything. Don't tell anyone." I watched him, feeling nothing but a profound, cold pity. Then, the real snake in the room spoke. Serafina, who had been watching David's collapse with a look of pure disgust, turned her eyes on me. Her charm was gone. Her face was a mask of reptilian fury. "You set him up," she hissed. I almost laughed. "I beg your pardon. You did this? You gave him access. You watched him. You wanted him to fail." She stood up, leaning over my desk. "You're jealous. You're a dried-up old woman. And you're pathologically jealous that he finally has a real woman in his life. You can't stand that he's happy." "Happy," I said. "This is what happiness looks like. Embezzlement, theft. This is what you've reduced him to." Serafina's eyes narrowed. She realized the attack wasn't working. So she changed tactics. She turned from me and looked at my sobbing son. "David, get up." He looked at her, his face streaked with tears. "Sarah, she knows everything. Get up." Her voice was a whip crack. David, like a beaten dog, stumbled to his feet. She put her arm around him and turned him to face me. "Choose, David," she said, her voice low and vicious. "Her or me." David just stared, horrified. "What, Sarah? Don't. Choose, right now, because if you choose her," she said, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at me, "I will walk out that door and I will go straight to the Boston Globe. I will tell them this entire story. I will tell them his doting mother has been abusing him for years, controlling his money, and when he finally tried to take what was rightfully his, you accused him of stealing." I went numb. The audacity, the pure, venomous evil of the lie was breathtaking. She was threatening to accuse me of the very crimes they had committed. She was going to paint me as an abusive monster to cover their tracks. I looked at David. This was the moment, the final, definitive test. His mother, who had given him everything, or the parasite who was threatening to destroy us all. He was trapped. He looked at me, his eyes wide with terror, not terror of her, but terror of exposure. He was afraid of his name in the papers. He was afraid of being cut off. He was afraid of losing her. He made his choice. He visibly straightened, pulling away from my gaze and aligning himself with her. He took her hand. "Mom," he said, and his voice was cold, accusatory. "You did this. You pushed us. This is all your fault. You never gave me a chance." There it was, the final betrayal. The knife, pushed in and twisted. In that second, the last embers of my maternal love died. The grief for the son I'd lost was instantly replaced by the clarity of a CEO facing a catastrophic liability. I stood up. "Very well," I said. My voice was calm, the voice I used to close a deal. "You have 1 week. You have until Thanksgiving Day. You will come to the house. You will apologize to me, and you will present a full confession to the board, along with a plan for complete restitution. If you do not, I will proceed. I will have you arrested, and I will have you removed." David's face crumpled. "Mom, Thanksgiving. You can't. 1 week. David," I said, walking to the door and holding it open. "Get out of my office." He stumbled out, shepherded by her. Serafina gave me one last look over her shoulder, a look of pure, confident contempt. She thought she had won. She thought I would never expose my own son. She thought my love for him was her shield. She failed to understand that the woman she'd just threatened was no longer his mother. I was his executioner. I left the study, the polished wood of Arthur's book cool and solid in my hands. The week of my ultimatum was over. It was Thanksgiving. David had not called. He had not come to my office. He had not confessed. He had made his final, fatal choice. I walked into the dining room. It was unrecognizable. My long mahogany table, the one that had hosted Nobel laureates and struggling poets, was draped in a garish gold-sequined runner. The centerpieces were enormous, tasteless sprays of dyed feathers and crystals, so tall you couldn't see the person opposite you. Serafina sat at the head of the table, my husband's seat, holding court. The room was filled with her people. There was a young woman who was apparently TikTok famous, a man who called himself a crypto strategist, and several couples who looked like they'd stepped out of a catalogue for aggressively new money. They had no connection to Boston, no interest in culture, and certainly no idea who Arthur Vance was. I just have to say, Sarah, the TikTok girl, was gushing. "What you've done with this house is a miracle. It was so, I don't know, brown before. You've given it life." Margot, sitting at the other end, raised her wine glass. "She has the vision, darling. Some people are just stuck in the past. My daughter is a visionary." "To vision," the crypto man cheered. They all drank. A toast to the erasure of my life. I found my seat, relegated to the middle of the table, placed between two people who didn't bother to speak to me. I looked for my son. He was there, seated next to Serafina, but he was a shell. His face was waxy and pale, his eyes fixed on his empty plate. He didn't look at me. Not once. He looked like a man attending his own execution. He had the haunted look of someone who knew, on some level, that he had traded his soul for absolutely nothing. Serafina was radiant, lapping up the empty praise, her diamond flashing as she gestured. laughing her high, false laugh. She and her mother were in total control, queens of a stolen castle. This was their victory dinner. And then, just as Serafina was lifting her glass to propose another toast to herself, the doorbell chimed, loud and insistent in the sudden quiet. Serafina's eyes narrowed. Who could that be? I didn't invite anyone else. A moment later, the butler, a man who had worked for my family for 20 years and looked as miserable as I felt, appeared at the door. Madam, he said, his voice stiff. It is Ms. Brenda, my sister. Before Serafina could give an order, Brenda was already walking in. Brenda, my younger sister, is the complete opposite of me. She's loud, she's blunt, and as the sharpest corporate lawyer in the city, she has a built-in zero-tolerance policy for fools. Ellie, she boomed, ignoring everyone else and striding over to hug me. Happy Thanksgiving? Then, she turned to the table, her eyes landing on Serafina. Her voice was loud, projecting to every corner of the room. Sorry I'm late. I did call. Serafina? But you told me I wasn't on the guest list. You said it was a small family affair and you just didn't have room. Brenda's eyes swept across the table of 15 strangers. Looks like you found the room after all. I decided to come by anyway. You know, for family. The silence was absolute. The crypto strategist looked confused. The TikTok girl's smile was frozen. Serafina's face was a mask of pure fury. She had been publicly exposed as a liar and a gatekeeper, and she had lost control of her audience. For the first time all night, I smiled. A real, genuine smile. Brenda, I said, my voice warm. I'm so glad you made it. Of course, she said, pulling up an empty chair from against the wall. I wouldn't miss it. Serafina, trapped, could do nothing. She plastered a toxic smile on her face. Well, what a surprise. Robert, she snapped at the butler. Set another place. The perfect, curated party was broken. My witness had arrived. The stage was finally set. The laughter and chatter finally died down as the plates were cleared. Serafina was flushed with wine and victory. I stood up, my chair making a soft sound on the hardwood floor. Every eye turned to me. I picked up the small, cloth-wrapped package from my lap. Sarah, thank you for hosting, I said, my voice clear and carrying to every corner. It has been illuminating. Now, if everyone will indulge me, I have a traditional family presentation, a gift for my son. I walked to the end of the table and stood beside David. I placed the gift in front of him. This, I said, is the Boston Letters, your father's first book of poetry. He bound 100 copies by hand in our basement, and we sold them in Quincy Market to raise the first dollars for the VLF. This was his personal copy. This book is the foundation, David. It is our beginning. I unwrapped it and handed it to him. His hands were shaking. He took the book, his thumb tracing the faded gold leaf of the title. I saw tears well in his eyes. For a split second, I saw the boy I had raised, the boy who had loved his father. And then, Serafina shattered the moment. She let out a high, shrieking laugh. My God, Eleanor, seriously. After that whole scene in the living room, a musty, mouldy old book. Before David could react, she snatched the priceless volume from his hands. Baby, she said, her voice a cruel mockery of affection. This is exactly what I'm talking about. This is why we can't move forward. She's always trying to pull you back, drowning you in all this sentimental junk. And with a flick of her wrist, before I or Brenda could even stand, she turned and threw the book straight into the heart of the roaring fireplace. The entire room gasped. There was no sound but the sharp, sudden crackle as the dry, 70-year-old pages and the cured leather cover caught the flame. It was engulfed instantly. I didn't look at the fire. I looked at David. He was frozen, his mouth half open, his eyes wide, staring at the flames. He watched his father's soul turn to ash. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He didn't even try to save it. He just let it burn. That was it. The last thread was severed. A calm, cleaner than any I had ever known, settled over me. I took my phone from my evening bag. The room was so quiet. The click of the screen unlocking was audible. I dialed my estate lawyer. "You're putting him on speakerphone," Brenda whispered, horrified. "Yes," I said. The line rang once. "Mr. Salazar, Eleanor Vance. Apologies for the late hour. Eleanor, is something wrong? I need you to immediately execute the toxicity clause in David Vance's private trust. Suspend all payments, all access, and freeze all assets within... Yes, right now, tonight. Thank you." I ended the call. David's head snapped toward me, his face paper white. "Mom!" "What?" I was already dialing again. "Julia, it's Eleanor. Wake up. I need you to call an emergency. 9 a.m. board meeting for tomorrow morning. The agenda is the immediate removal of David Vance from the board on grounds of embezzlement. I have the complete proof. And Julia. Have the locks on his office changed before he arrives. Thank you." I ended the second call. Serafina had risen from her chair. You bitch." I made a third, final call. My sister Brenda picked up her phone at the table. "Brenda, you are now on notice," I said, my voice like ice. Every guest was a statue, watching this execution. I looked at my sister. "As my counsel, I want you to begin eviction proceedings immediately for David Vance, Serafina Vance, and Margot Dubois from 84 Beacon Street. They have 24 hours to vacate the premises." "Mom!" David finally shrieked, lurching forward. You can't do this. It's Thanksgiving." I clicked my phone off and slipped it back into my bag. I looked at my son, the stranger standing in the ruins of his father's house, next to the fire where his legacy was smoke. "You burned your foundation, David. You made your choice. You stood by and watched her do it. From now on, you are on your own." I turned to Brenda, who was already grabbing her coat, a slow, grim smile spreading across her face. "Let's go, sis," I said, pulling my own wrap around my shoulders. "I think Grill 23 still has our table." We walked out the front door, past the stunned, silent guests, and into the cold, clean Boston air, leaving nothing but the smell of smoke and the wreckage of their future behind us. Thank you all so much for listening. Please comment below and let us know where you're listening from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story be heard.